Hi folks, and welcome to Philosophy According to Eddie. And tonight we're going to be looking at religious language again, but we're going to look at the 20th century perspectives, verification and falsification. Now these are two separate ideas, even though they are verifying, i.e. proving something to be true, and falsifying, proving something to be false, in our everyday language would be considered to be two sides of the same coin. But they are two different ideas. They address the same idea nonetheless, or they address the same question, should we say. Do religious statements have meaning? And if so, what? What is that meaning? The verification principle and the falsification principle do suggest that religious language statements are problematic. They don't support religious language statements for their own reasons. So the verification principle, the logical positivists, who are a group of philosophers, suggest that statements are either meaningful or meaningless. And they suggest that that's based on whether it's a cognitive statement or a non-cognitive statement. If it's a cognitive statement, then it is meaningful. If it is a non-cognitive statement, it is meaningless. If you don't know about cognitive, non-cognitive statements, you'll need to watch the other video on religious language on the apophatic and cataphatic way. That considers these two types of statement. The falsification principle takes a slightly different approach in that it's more interested in whether statements are scientific or non-scientific rather than meaningful or meaningless. So they suggest that statements can either be scientifically factual or they are non-factual. But it's not about meaning. There's a good reason for that, but that we'll come to later. The overall feeling, though, of the verification principle and the falsification principle is that there are problems with religious statements, as I said before. For the verification principle, religious statements cannot be verified, i.e. proven true, and therefore they have no meaning. They are non-factual. The falsification principle doesn't look at meaning. This is very important. It doesn't look at meaning at all. But it suggests that religious statements can't be falsified, i.e. proven to be false, and therefore they are not valid claims to factual knowledge, to scientific truth, in a sense. So they can't claim scientific truth because they cannot be falsified or proven false. Don't mix this up with the other definition of falsification, which is where you make something, like a false statement, for example. We're talking here about whether it can be proven false. So they're both looking at this idea of factual cognitive statements. A fact would be a cognitive statement. Verification and falsification principles suggest religious language is non-cognitive and therefore either has no meaning or cannot claim factual truth. Now we'll be looking at the views of Ayer, Brummer, Emmett and Swinburne with regard to the verification principle, and we'll be looking at the views of Popper, Flew, Hare, Mitchell and HICC with regard to the falsification principle. The verification principle suggests that meaningful statements can be verified. So for a statement to be meaningful, it must be verifiable. Now what we mean by verifiable is that it can be proven true or false. Now there is a strong form and there is a weak form of verifiable. A strong form of verifiable is a direct form of verification. So for example, I might say the majority of the writing on this board is blue. Yep, we can verify that straight away. It doesn't have to be true though. I could say the majority of the writing on this board is red. It's still verifiable. It could be proven true. Just because it's not true doesn't mean there's a problem. We know how to prove it, we just look at the board. So, me talking about the colour of the writing on the board is verifiable. We know how to check it in order to verify it. The weak or indirect form of verification, weak verification principle, is where we know what we would have to do in order to verify something, but we can't do it. A good example of this would be to say there is life on Mars. Now at the moment, we haven't got the technology to appropriately check in enough detail to say whether there is life on Mars. We've got some ideas, but not enough. But the point is, 100, 200 years in the future, it is conceivable that technology would allow us to check this. So, it's, from a weak perspective, it is verifiable. We can go out there and we can check. In theory. It's just that we can't do it at the moment. So, both of these situations, you can verify something. Now, the other alternative would be for me to say, for example, God exists, which is a religious statement, and the problem is we can't think of any way that we can actually verify that. There is no way that we can think of, no technology, no godometer that we can use to find out what or where or how God exists. So it can't be verified, it can't be proven true or disproven, and therefore it's a meaningless statement. There's no point asking it. What's the point in asking a question? It's got no meaning, because you can never know the answer. The only true, verifiable, meaningful statements, the only two categories, are either tautology, which is a priori, or empirically verifiable statements, which are a posteriori. Tautology would be a statement that is by definition correct. A triangle has three sides. 1, 2, 3. Always true. That is a tautology. It by its own definition, it's true. That's verifiable. Or it can be verified empirically. Penguins can't fly. We know how to go about checking that. We just need to check every penguin in the world. It's difficult, and we're going to have to rely on the weak verification there, because we can't check every single penguin. So, but we know how we could check it, and therefore it is verifiable. So these are the two types, whereas religious statements aren't verifiable. You may as well just be saying nonsense, saying gobbledygook, because they're meaningless. Now this is a very radical approach to religious language, or language in general, to say if you can't prove it to be true, it has no meaning. As in, you may as well just be going, what's the point in saying something if it can't be proven true scientifically? That is radical. It's putting a lot of faith in science, and that's where a lot of the issues come from. Firstly, there's the somewhat entertaining point that the verification principle itself can't be verified. The verification principle says meaningful statements must be verified. Yeah, but how do we know that? How do we prove that to be true? How do we define this test of meaning? Have we got a meaningometer that we can put out there, along with the godometer? You can't actually prove the verification principle to be true. And we can't think of any way of proving the verification principle to be true. So, in itself, the verification principle fails the verification principle. Go figure. It also runs the risk of foundationalism. Now, foundationalism is the idea that there is this self-evident truth out there that we all just accept. That is the foundation of all knowledge. But the problem with foundationalism, in this case the idea that meaningful statements must be verifiable, is that there's no real justification for it. Why do meaningful statements have to be verifiable? Who decided that? How is it so apparently self-evident? Some take issue with that. It's making a lot of assumptions as well, this verification principle. It's looking at the world from a purely scientific perspective. What about poetry? What about art? Would you walk into an art gallery, look at a painting on the wall and go, that's false, or that's true? No, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you do that? The whole point of art and of poetry and music isn't to prove it true or false. It's to engage with it in a different way. But it still has meaning, even if you can't prove it true or false. I mean, according to the verification principle, we can't say art is true, therefore it's meaningless. No, it has got meaning. It's got real meaning to a lot of people. It's a way of communicating. And that's why many consider it to be very reductive. It reduces everything down to yes, no, tick box questions. So the responses that have come on from this, particularly with regard to religious statements, are that religious statements are classified differently. In the same way that poetry and art are classified differently, religious statements are classified differently. And so people like Dawkins, who's a classic believer of the verification principle, suggesting that we can't prove religious statements to be true, therefore they must be false or meaningless. Dawkins and Hume, who came before him, are getting this wrong. Religious statements belong to a different class. Now, Brumer suggested that it's incorrect to deny this sort of metaphysical approach, this idea of a world and of meaning beyond our tangible physical universe. And in a sense, he's suggesting this is a category error. He's suggesting that because verification logical positivists, do deny the meaning of the metaphysical. They say there's no point talking about the metaphysical. There's no point talking about the meaning of life. It's meaningless. Well, Brumer says no, it's incorrect. You're creating a category error. You're suggesting everything can be put in a scientific category. But actually there are two categories. The scientific and the religious. The tangible world understanding and the greater understanding of life's meaning. And this comes as well from D.Z. Phillips, who was before Brumer, who suggested that religion and science are in two separate categories, looking at the world from two different perspectives. In the same way that you couldn't try to understand art using the principles of physics, you can't try to understand religious language based on scientific principles. That was D.Z. Phillips, and Brumer built on that. Dorothy Emmett went back to the idea of analogy. That was in the previous video. If you haven't watched it, watch it. And suggested that analogy is not verifiable, but it still has meaning. We understand analogies. They have meaning in terms of how they allow us to understand the world. So, therefore, this logical positivist approach is misunderstanding this idea of meaning. If you can understand analogy, and if analogies have meaning, surely the logical positivists are getting it wrong. There's also the question of significance of a statement. Even if you want to define meaningful in this way, well, let's think about significance. If you were to say, praise be to God, that has significance to people. It means something in some way to people, so it's significant. And an interesting way of understanding that significance, or that it's a significant statement, is that you can respond to it. Praise be to God. Yes, praise be to God. Or to choose a different one, shut the door. Or why should I? You can respond, you can create a dialogue. Whereas if you just went at someone, there's no meaningful response. So, the fact that you can respond to it suggests there's some sort of significance, some sort of meaning. And therefore, this verification principle is missing out on that type of meaning. Richard Swinburne came up with a response as well, but as is unfortunately the case with a lot of Richard Swinburne stuff, it was criticised quite heavily. Useful for the exams though. But anyway, so bad luck Swinburne, good news for you. So Richard Swinburne suggested that you could make a meaningful statement even if it's not verifiable. And he uses the analogy of a toy cupboard. He suggests, well, he says, this statement has got meaning but it's not verifiable. And the statement goes, toys come out of the cupboard at night and dance around when no one is around. They don't set off any detection devices, they can't be detected. But then they go back into the cupboard, and by the time people come back, they appear to be lifeless again. Think Toy Story. And he suggests that this is a meaningful statement. We understand the ideas and the principles here. We understand the theory at work. But you can't verify it. You can't prove what the toys are doing. But we still understand it. It must have meaning because we can understand it. Unfortunately though, here come the criticisms. Well, unfortunately for him, good for you. Understanding doesn't necessarily mean meaning. We can understand the statement, that's true. Toys come out of the cupboard at night and dance around. Yeah, we understand what it means. But we could also understand the statement, the bus is sitting in our stomach. Bit strange. Doesn't really make much sense. Now, you could argue that that is a verifiable statement. We can check to see if the bus is in our stomach. But also it seems to be like, we understand what it means, but it seems like nonsense. Or, to use a different example, the bus is travelling through the air. Like radio waves. The bus is travelling on radio frequencies. Well, yeah, we understand it, but it doesn't really have any meaning. It's a nonsense statement. So you could argue that there's a difference between understanding what the words mean in that order and actually finding some sort of proper, realistic meaning in it. So understanding and meaning are two different things. The other issue is more of an issue of definition. We can define what toys are. So at least within this statement, we can define that a toy is a lifeless being that children play with. Lifeless object that children play with. Not lifeless being. That suggests something completely different. Anyway, so a lifeless object that children play with. God, however, is not definable, so surely Swinburne is making a mistake here. He's trying to equate something that's undefinable with something that is definable. Now, it doesn't matter where you come from on the debate, it causes problems. You don't have to know those problems necessarily. If you want to know, let me know. But essentially, you can't equate something that's definable with something that isn't. So that's the verification principle, greatly criticised as overly scientific, but within its own rules works quite well, with the exception of the verification principle itself not being verifiable. So we've had a look at whether religious language statements can be meaningful, according to logical positivism, but what about whether they are in fact at all scientific in general? For this, we need to look to the falsification principle. The falsification principle suggests that for a statement to be scientific, factual, then it must be falsifiable. I.e., you need to actually know what it is that would cause your statement or your belief to be false. It suggests that proving something is true, i.e. the verification principle, is actually quite unhelpful. It doesn't allow you to progress. if you keep doing tests to keep proving what you know to be true, then you design tests that make sure that you get the result that you want. Whereas the truly scientific thing to do is to try to find something that would make your test false. This is why science has null hypotheses. The whole idea being you want to test it until destruction. Keep testing your theory, make it harder and harder and harder until you prove it to be false. That's how you progress understanding. And that was the view of Karl Popper. And he believed that it was all about falsehood. It was all about proving it false. That was how you got good knowledge. The more specific you are, the more facts that you can actually be specific about, the more likely it is that you'll be false. But that's actually how you get the best information. That was his view. However, Ayer and HICC to a degree misrepresented him. When they wrote about Popper, translating him from German, they suggested that actually the falsification principle was about meaning. So a meaningful sentence is one that can be falsified. That's not true. It's not about meaning. This is about whether it's scientific, whether we're proving scientific facts. Popper wanted to set the boundaries of science. So he wanted to say, this is what science is about. This is about fact proving. And Anthony Flew then took this to a symposium and basically posed the question, can God be falsified? So this is the Theology and Falsification Symposium. It's really worth reading. It takes about half an hour to read. It really isn't long, but trust me, it's worth it. It's written in ordinary language. Definitely do it. And it was between Flew, Hare and Mitchell, and then HICC joined in later. So Anthony Flew asked the question, can God be falsified? And he referred to John Wisdom's parable of the gardener, suggesting if two explorers were to go into the jungle and come across something that appeared to be a garden, so perfectly maintained, selected flowers, cut grass, that kind of thing, but there was no sign of people around, then one of the explorers might say, well, it's pretty obvious. There's an invisible gardener who can't be detected, who shows up when no one else is around and when there are no cameras. That is how this garden is maintained. Now, Flew suggested that the problem here is you can never prove it to be false. You can never prove this statement to be false because there are all of these things built in, like the fact that the gardener's invisible, can't be detected, only comes out when people can't detect the gardener. This prevents you from falsifying it. And so he uses this parable to suggest, surely therefore, we need to find a situation where God can be falsified, but we can't. Can God be falsified? And how can you make a genuine assertion of fact about God, i.e. God is loving, God is good, if you cannot falsify it? Surely you can't make an assertion like that because it can't be falsified. So Hare was the first to respond to it, R.M. Hare, and suggested Flew is kind of correct. He is correct by his own criteria, in that statements about God cannot be falsified. But he suggests that religious statements have got different standards, different logical standards. They don't follow the same logic as scientific statements. And he refers to Blick's. Now, Blick is your worldview. It's a life-changing but non-verifiable or falsifiable worldview. Your worldview affects how you live your life, so it's life-changing. That could be religious, atheistic. It could be, using the example that Hare gave, a paranoia that all the dons, the people who are in charge of a university, all the dons at a university are trying to kill you. The suggestion here is that it's a mindset, and it changes how you live your life, but you can't verify it or falsify it, because it's entirely in your head. Because it's in your head, it can't be true and it can't be false. It's just a way of thinking. Now, it might be to other people from the outside. They might go, well, no, nobody's trying to kill you. Well, yes, of course God exists. But to you, it can never be proven wrong and it can never be proven right, according to Ayer. It can't be changed. And that's what makes it non-falsifiable, non-verifiable. Like, if it were someone who believed that all the Dons were trying to kill them, they wouldn't believe anyone who said, no, they're not trying to kill you. Because their mind view would be, yeah, they would say that. They would say that because they're all out against me. Now he suggests religious statements are like this. People always find a way in which religious statements can't be falsified. Flew suggested this was a serious problem. The idea that there is no way that someone would deny God was loving. No one could prove that God wasn't loving, because every time there seemed to be evidence that God wasn't loving, they'd say, oh well, God works in mysterious ways, so it can't be falsifiable. But Ayer suggests, yeah, it's not falsifiable, but it's more to do with this blick, it's to do with this world view. And so you have to use different logical standards when you're trying to talk about religious statements. The scientific just doesn't work. Flew wasn't very happy with this explanation. He suggested, well, religious believers must be asserting claims, because they're saying God exists. They must be asserting something that's true. They're not just saying this is what's happening in my head. They must be actually making these assertions. They must be in the scientific realm. So surely scientific logic must exist, or must apply. So Flew wasn't very happy with this. He suggested, yeah, religious believers do make these assertions. They do make scientific style assertions, but they can't be falsified. So surely they're not scientific. Now, HICC, although Christian, opposed Ayer's approach by suggesting, well, if it can't be verified or falsified, then surely it can't be correct or incorrect. So the fact that someone else can look in from the outside and say that's correct or that's not correct, surely that means that it is verifiable, it is falsifiable, and that Ayer is essentially mixing up the idea of perspective, the subjective and the objective. He's suggesting that your subjective viewpoint of everyone's out to get me, for example, can't be proven right or wrong objectively, but it can. And from this, we could also then develop and suggest, well, a sane person, we're talking about a lunatic here, surely, someone who's paranoid. In fact, Ayer refused to them as a lunatic. A sane person would accept the possibility that they're wrong, surely. They'd say, well, I might be wrong, but I believe this. And that's really leading us into Mitchell. So we've had Flew, we've had Ayer, who have both suggested that religious statements aren't falsifiable. Mitchell suggests, well, religious statements are factual. They are facts, they are scientific, but they're not falsifiable. So how can something be non-falsifiable but still factual? Well, he suggests believers accept, a true believer, a good believer, will accept they could be wrong. They accept that they could be false, but they believe that they're true. And when we're talking about belief, believing you're true is different to... So believing you're right is different to being right. because believing is sort of projecting, suggesting, well, I think I am right, but I might be wrong. So here, belief, faith, religious statements, which are all about faith, about believing something, aren't falsifiable. You can't say, well, I believe in God. False, you don't believe in God. No, it doesn't work. So, you know, from their blick, if you like, from their point of view, I believe in God is their life-changing view. And yeah, it's not verified, so it's not falsifiable. But believers accept that they could be wrong. And so the statements that they make are statements of attempting to make statements of fact. I believe God is true. I believe it's a fact, but I might be wrong. So Mitchell really gives a better assessment than Hare does. Hare starts getting there with this idea about beliefs, but it's Mitchell who suggests that although beliefs are non-falsifiable, you can still make that assertion to fact because you accept you might be wrong. John HICC tries to come up with a more simple approach, a more an approach that brings together the religious and the scientific in perhaps a more tangible way, because all of this is quite difficult to understand. But HICC suggests that you get your verification on death. You know, you die, and you show up in heaven, or in hell, I suppose, although HICC didn't believe in hell. But you show up in heaven, that's verified. There you go. It's proven after death, essentially. So HICC is suggesting it's not proven in life. So from a purely sort of mortal point of view, it's non-falsifiable. But if you look into immortality, that's when it becomes verifiable. Problem here is, though, HICC's talking about verification. You can have your belief verified when you die. Problem is, you can't have your belief falsified, because if you were wrong and God doesn't exist, you can't be proven false, you're just dead. So you can be proven right if you're a religious believer, but you can't be proven wrong. So strictly speaking, this isn't falsification. This is only verification. So it's quite a difficult conversation, but in short it goes flu suggesting statements about God can't be falsified, therefore they can't be statements of fact. Hare suggests beliefs in God cannot be falsified, but they have a lot of value to believers. People believe strongly in religion, but that can't be falsified. Mitchell suggests that strong belief is there, and you believe in it, and your belief can't be falsified, but you accept that the truth of the matter could be falsifiable. So you might be right, you might be wrong, but you believe something that's non-falsifiable. And HICC suggests that you can be verified after death, but he doesn't suggest you can be falsified after death. It's important to remember that Hare did accept the value of religious statements to believers. So even if you accept the fact that or you accept Flu's idea that religious statements can't be falsified, there's still value. It means something to believers, and that mustn't be forgotten. So there you have it. We've looked at the verification and falsification principles. We've looked at the ideas of whether religious statements can have meaning in the verification principle, and whether they can be scientifically proven as fact in the falsification principle. We've looked at various ways in which these two principles can be applied, how the verification principle is very scientific but quite narrow focused, whereas the falsification principle there's a lot of disagreement about. So, if you've got any questions, of course, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching. See you next time.